Welcome back to the Visually Hidden Podcast. My name's Peter O'Brien, and of course, again, today with me is Mr. Stephen Bendler and Mademoiselle Anne Milleville.
Bonjour.
Hello.
To recap, we've been discussing the merits of horror as a starting point in careers, and today I'd like to just take a little step into the start of the career and talk a little bit about horror short films. We've kind of touched on this point a little bit as we've been trucking along here. We discussed how Stephen and I met on a short horror film called Strange Aeons back in 2004.
That is a lifetime ago.
Yeah, I wasn't even able to drink yet.
Really?
Well, I was able to, just not legally, but that's
Right.
a moot point at best. And then we segued into our own little horror excursion together with a little short film called Trick or Treat, currently available on the Visually Hidden YouTube channel. So check it out. It's only 3 minutes and let us know what you think. I don't know. I mean, I've also worked on a number of other horror short films over the years, a lot of them for other people. But the other short horror film that I've actually worked on that I've produced and created is called The House on Peach Avenue. And funny enough, I did this short film shortly after moving to a new state. And that was my gateway into the local film community. It was almost like I had to start from scratch, going back to horror and horror short films. By this point, I had already done a feature documentary and a feature narrative, Misery Loves Company, but not having any contacts in this new state, I went where the action was. And of course, the action is always somehow in the horror genre. So I got involved in this project. It was supposed to be an anthology film, so it was going to be a collection of short films, which is really the only viable outlet for short films is in an anthology. They don't really get a wide release except on one's YouTube channel. So if you want to see a short film, you usually have to track it down and or find a collection that it is a part of. Since we're watching an anthology film this week, I thought it would be kind of fun to just start talking about that.
I watched it again. I watched it when you had first put it up, and I was like, oh, man. I was bummed because, obviously I want you to continue to make films, but I was like, no, I can't be a part of it. He lives on the other side of the country. But I'm going to watch it anyway, and I'm going to support him. I thought it was great. It was a lot. It's a lot of fun. Good scares in it. Great atmosphere. The opening shot gives me the vibes of, like, The Shining. It's the same similar kind of, I don't know if that's what you were going for, but that's at least what I took away from it. Louise is great in that. For someone who's not really always stepping in front of the camera, she does more of her magic on the other side of the camera. It was nice to see her there. I think it was really effective. I thought the music was good. And my favorite part is the creature monster aspect of it. I thought that was really cool, the way it just, the monster really popped on screen. So that was, for me, my favorite part.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very kind. It took a lot of work to arrive at that result. Again, we're talking about The House on Peach Avenue, which is also available on the YouTube channel. It's about 20 minutes because, as I said, it was supposed to be part of an anthology collection that never really came together. And so the film just kind of exists on its own in the Visually Hidden archive. But it was a fun project. It was an interesting project. I'm sure we're going to talk more about it at length at a later date, and we may even have some special guests who are involved in the project join us.
Yeah, I liked it. I watched it for the first time, I think, this year, the beginning of this year. And you feel the tension from the very beginning. And as you said, Steve, Louise is fantastic in it. So, yeah, really, I loved it. And, I'm used to watching indie movies. And honestly, it's one of the best I've watched. Really. It's not because I know you, but really, it's a very good one.
Well, thank you again. That's high praise from the people who know me personally. So
There you go. You can't do better than that, right?
Yeah. No, I'm feeling really good this morning. Yeah, it was a very interesting project, though, and honestly, it was also a very difficult project because we actually wound up refilming the entire thing. I don't know if I've ever told you guys this story, but for the benefit of our listening audience, I will recap very, very briefly because, again, as I said, we'll probably be talking about it extensively in the future. But this film, It came to me kind of almost like an assignment. As I said, it was part of an anthology that was being produced locally. And so I signed up to be a part of it. And a script bank went out to all of the participants. You were able to read all the various scripts and then select the one that you wanted to film. And then it was up to you to film it. So I chose this one because it appealed to me the most. However, the original script was a found footage film, and I don't really like found footage films. So I initially rewrote it to film it as a regular narrative. And I was maybe about 70% through filming, and I was not happy with the result. And if you know anything about me, I'm a little bit of a perfectionist. And so if I wasn't happy, then I wasn't going to be able to perform at a peak level. And so I struggled with this for a little bit. And then finally I was in the hospital as my wife, who stars in the film as Brenda, as my wife was giving birth. And upon the birth of my son, I was sitting in the hospital and I was thinking, gee whiz, wouldn't it be great if Brenda wound up in the hospital at the end of this film instead of the originally scripted fate? So I pitched this idea to my wife, who had just given birth.
So that's what you were thinking as she just gave birth. How can I utilize this room? Let me put this on the list of assets.
Exactly.
So in essence, two things were born that day: your son and this idea.
That's correct. That is correct, Stephen. I selfishly was sitting there thinking only of myself and how I could best take advantage of this situation. And so I pitched the idea to my wife. She's very, very accommodating, and I'm going to go so far as to say that she spoils me. So she agreed to my pitch. I went home to get most of my filming equipment, including my tripod and my little dolly and the camera and lenses. And I brought everything back to the hospital room. And our second night in the room, I set everything up. It was about 3:30 in the morning when we filmed this, but I had storyboarded it in my mind and I explained everything to her. And so we just filmed this little itty bitty final scene for the house on Peach Avenue. And then I took that scene home, I cut it together, and I showed it to the other people involved in the film. And I said, listen, we've got to reshoot this entire movie because now we have a really, really good ending in a really good location. So again, it's taking advantage of the situation you find yourself in to maximize production value.
And the great thing about that is, right, you can just bring the camera in and they're like, oh, he's just filming his newborn baby, right? So there's nothing sketchy about that. There's nothing weird about that.
I mean, it was a little weird. I got some looks from the nurses when I was like moving through the hallway, filming nothing but atmosphere. So anyways, we filmed that scene, I cut it together, and then I showed it to the people involved, and they of course agreed, yeah, no, this is a different film and we can't ignore this. So I rewrote the script entirely, utilizing some key elements and I used as much of the dialogue as possible from the original. So it's kind of a joint screenwriting credit between myself and the original screenwriter, Matthew Keister. And then I started filming it again, and I'm a lot happier with the result, which is why most people will never ever see the A cut of the house on Peach Avenue.
I want to applaud you, number one, for having the presence of mind to say, hey, I'm in the hospital. My wife just gave birth to my first child, but I see an opportunity here. And just to have the balls to do it, to execute it. Like, I'm going to drag all this equipment here. I'm going to make this happen. So way to utilize, your resources, what you have around you. So kudos to you for that. But also the other thing I think is an important thing to talk about, since you're talking about independent filmmaking, is trusting your gut. I mean, and that goes on so many different levels, right? So you felt like the first cut of what you had wasn't good enough or wasn't up to your standard, and it didn't sit well with you. And then you figured out, okay, this is what I have to do. And that happens even in the big leagues, like Back to the Future. They filmed like 75% of that movie, and they're like, this is not working. And they went back and they redid it. So no matter where you are, I think, in the filmmaking journey, trust your gut.
I think that's a very valid point, Stephen, and I agree, and I appreciate all of that as well. And I think it's 100% true. I mean, if something isn't feeling right, or if you're not invested, it's going to come through in the result. People will see that hesitation, people will see that chemistry, people will see whatever it is that's out of sync. It will come through in the final result. You can maybe sometimes hide it in editing or with effects if that's within your means and your budget. But for the most part, if something is not right, you should not continue until you get it right or until you're able to make it right. And so, again, we'll talk about it more extensively, but I just wanted to touch on it because, again, horror as a starting point, short films as a starting point, they kind of go hand in hand, but the only real fate for a horror short film is either a YouTube channel or an anthology. And this week we began Shocktober with Twilight Zone, the movie, which is a collection of 4 short stories combined into one feature film, as is the case with most anthology films. And there are some pretty big names involved in this particular film. We're going to get into that in a moment, but we continue this with a wild card, which we will all discuss. From there, we moved on to The Menu, which is a newer film, and I'm excited to hear everybody's comments on that one. Then we watched a classic from the 80s called House, and we followed that up with Buried, starring Ryan Reynolds, and only Ryan Reynolds. And then we had The Last Drive-In Halloween, which only I was privy to, so I'll talk very, very briefly about that experience. And then we had X-Files board game night. So let's get right into it. Twilight Zone, the movie. Steven, you said you were looking forward to this film the most because you had not seen it, and I was a little surprised. This film is from 1983. And there is a lot of tragedy surrounding this particular film, literally, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But before we do, Steven, what did you think of Twilight Zone, the movie? How did it grab you?
I didn't like it at all. I had avoided it for years, and I think it was for good reason. I knew deep in my heart it would never do the original show justice. And even though I knew there was a lot of heavy hitters in the directing department taking on these individual stories, I just knew it could never live up to the series. So I'm watching it, and I gotta say, the book and the opening and the closing of it didn't feel very Twilight Zone to me. It felt more Creepshow to me. And while I love Creepshow, and in fact it's my favorite horror anthology movie of all time, the original Creepshow, those segments felt very out of place and more for a Creepshow type of a movie. What I felt was lacking the most was the humanity and the heart, which I think that the original series really accelerates at. It just wasn't there. It felt like Hollywood's attempt to capitalize on something. It felt like a very hollow Hollywood version of something that's really, really good. Just to make sure that I wasn't being overly harsh or critical, I actually went back and I watched each of the episodes that the movie's based on. And I gotta say, they fall really, really short. Mostly the last entry in that film is The Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. And I mean, John Lithgow starts at a 12. And I mean, for an actor, where do you go from there? I mean, when you watch the Shatner performance, it starts out like mild. He's having a little bit of, anxiety, and he's afraid of getting on the plane. And then it just builds and it builds and it builds. There's a chilling vibe that comes along with the Twilight Zone. And then that's not to say that all Twilight Zone episodes are creepy or chilling, because then you have Kick the Can, which is a very poignant and a very, I guess, a good commentary on how we view ourselves as we age and as we get older. And that one was handled by Steven Spielberg, who should have crushed it, but he didn't. And I think it's like you said before, we were talking about earlier, when the vibe is not right, when you're not feeling it, when you're not invested in it, it doesn't work. And because of the tragedy, he lost connection with it. He didn't want to be involved with it anymore. So, and we talked about Duel a couple of weeks ago, and how you could see that that's the precursor for what's to come for Steven Spielberg. And that felt more like Spielberg than this. Like I said, I could go on and on about the things I didn't like about it. I mean, of course, there's some very good performances. I think for me, the most striking thing about every one of those vignettes is it just seemed a bit soulless, like no heart. It was, this is the spectacle of the Twilight Zone, but it wasn't the Twilight Zone.
I don't think the same thing, of course, because I didn't know the show, as Steve said. So the only thing I knew about the show was the music. So, of course, I wasn't disappointed. But for me, it's nice 5 short stories. That's what I could remember of this. So it was nice watching it, but it's not something I'm going to watch again and again. And the crazy thing is, I just read the name of the directors involved before watching it, and I was sure that the one made by Steven Spielberg was Time Out. The one with the story of the guy, the white guy who said racist comments, and then I'm not going to spoil the story, but I guess you understood. And I was surprised to see that actually Steven Spielberg made kick the can. I mean, it's a nice story, but as you said, it's not 100% Steven Spielberg. I was expecting something more, something deeper from him. So, but yeah, it was a nice thing to watch. I'm happy I did it because it's Twilight Zone is something really iconic. So that's something everybody that likes stories should watch it, of course. But yeah, I wasn't so impressed. I would say that.
The television series casts a pretty long shadow, especially the original series, just the ideas behind it and the stories present in it. It really was very groundbreaking for all time, honestly. There's stuff in that series that still resonates today. For me, Twilight Zone, the movie, it's one that I grew up with. It's one that I originally, I think, saw on the WPIX Shocktober program in New York. So I've lived with this film for a long time. Whenever I watch it, I get a sense of nostalgia because I think of, like, my childhood and watching it. And of course, the television series was always there, but I wasn't so critical as a child to draw lines of distinction that you could build great walls on. I just kind of accepted it as fun. And I didn't even know the filmmakers involved when I was a kid. I recognized some of the people in the film from other projects and other movies that I liked. Of course, Dan Aykroyd was a Ghostbuster. So this movie was automatically awesome because there was a Ghostbuster in it. And John Lithgow, I recognized from Harry and the Hendersons. So of course,
Yes.
this movie's awesome because the dad from Harry and the Hendersons is in it. So that as a child watching it, those were my impressions. Watching it as an adult, I have not seen this film for at least a decade, but I've studied this film over the course of that decade, again, because of the tragedy involved. For those of you who are not familiar with it, this film was conceived and produced by John Landis and Steven Spielberg. John Landis and Steven Spielberg were very, very, very good friends. For example, John Landis helped rig the collapsing deck in Jaws when they throw the wife's holiday roast into the ocean to try to catch Jaws. Well, John Landis had experience in special effects because he's had one of the most ridiculous careers in Hollywood. He helped rig that to collapse on cue for camera. He also appears in 1941 as, I believe, a paratrooper in the middle of the city. He parachutes down into the chaos that ensues in that film. Steven Spielberg has a cameo at the end of The Blues Brothers as well. So they were really close friends. John Landis's wife is a costume designer, and among other things, she designed the Indiana Jones costume. She's responsible for one of the most iconic characters, not only in cinema history, but in Steven Spielberg's career. And so they came together and they conceived, like, hey, you know what? Kind of like the opening scene in this film where they talk about their fondness for the shows, and they wanted to bring that back for a new generation. And since they were in a position professionally to be able to kind of do whatever they wanted, they decided, hey, let's bring back the Twilight Zone and make it into like an anthology franchise. And let's, let other people, up and coming filmmakers, take their shot at different stories, and we'll just try to revive this thing that we love to share with a new generation. It's the same thing that George Lucas did with Star Wars and the Flash Gordon serials. They wanted to take something from their childhood and share it with a new generation, not only to capitalize on it, but I think there was the sincerity of just wanting to share. All that being said, when it came time to film it, that wasn't the case. I believe they did film in order, and John Landis, his story is first. He films the kind of wraparound story with Dan Aykroyd in the beginning, and then the first story stars Vic Morrow. If you're not familiar with Vic Morrow, he's been in a ton of things. A quintessential character actor, and there is so much character in his face. He just has a very distinct and unique look. Like, you can look at him and be like, oh my God, that guy is pissed off. He's kind of like Steve. He's always angry. Right? So I feel like his casting for the character, regardless of what was written in the script, was a pretty obvious choice, and all things considered, a good choice. However, this is where the tragedy of this film comes into play. His character is basically an angry, hate-filled man. he's a racist and a bigot, and that comes shining through in the very first scene. He has an altercation at a bar with a man played by Stephen Williams from 21 Jump Street. So there we go again. That is the first time we saw him this week. It wasn't the last time we saw him this week. Yeah, he came back in House. We'll talk about that.
Okay.
Regarding the tragedy, though, you can go onto YouTube and you can actually see the footage. It's very horrifying and chilling, but they were performing a stunt for this particular sequence, and instead of using a stunt double, they used the actor Vic Morrow, and they used two small children who were not exactly legally cleared to be working on the film at that particular time. And there was a tragedy involving a helicopter that crashed into the actors, and Vic Morrow was decapitated by the helicopter blade along with two small children. And that's a point when most people would probably put the brakes on and reevaluate things. A lot of people hate on John Landis for this, and because he was the director of this segment, it was his decision. But at the same time, I don't think a lot of people know that he was in the helicopter. So if he knew this was going to happen, I don't think he would have gotten in the helicopter. And I mean, he gave the eulogy at Vic Morrow's funeral. I don't think he was exactly excited or thrilled about this outcome. It was a horrible, horrible accident, and I feel like he's been paying the price for it ever since, especially as years go by and the legend grows. And from there, it just soured the entire production. Of course, you know, Steve had mentioned about Steven Spielberg's segment and this tragedy, and the vibe, it just changed. And you could tell Steven Spielberg is not present in his segment. He just wanted to get in, get out, get it done because he was contractually obligated to perform his duties as a director and as a producer. But it really kind of, I think, changed the entire outcome of this film. Not only the subject matter of the first installment, but the ensuing result of the filmmaking practices just soured everything. When I was a kid, of course, I didn't know any of this, so I just kind of enjoyed the ride. And as a kid, I think I liked the third segment with the little boy who could change things with his mind, because it was a little boy who was the main character. So it's like, sweet, I'm represented. Woohoo! I think now the Nightmare at 20,000 Feet is probably the strongest segment of this film. It's directed by George Miller, who was hot off of Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior. That's why they brought him into this. And for me, that's kind of the high watermark of this film. John Lithgow, as Steven said, he starts on 12, and where do you go from there? Well, you go to 13 and 14 and 15 until you're wrestling with a federal air marshal for a firearm. But yeah, that's really kind of the highlight of this film. It's, if you can disassociate from the original series, there is entertainment value for sure. I personally, like I said, I have a fondness for this film from my youth. But if you look at it from a different point of view and a critical point of view, there's a lot to be desired within the film. I don't think it holds up the way it was originally intended or conceived to.
Yeah.
And it is interesting to note that the film was primarily written by Richard Matheson, who had worked on the original series, who had written some of the original episodes. And again, we talked about this when we talked about Duel, written by Richard Matheson. He also wrote the original story, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. So it's very interesting, again, just from a filmmaking point of view, to have source material in a script and then have a different vision behind that script, bring it to life in a different way. I mean, essentially, again, you have the same script writer for Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, right? Richard Matheson. And the original episode versus the movie version, it's the same screenwriter. So the variable is the director, who brings in his crew, who brings in his talent, who brings in his cast, and then shapes it into what he sees from that material. So again, the story is always a starting point, and the story should always be the strongest element, because again, that is the foundation that everything else is built on. From that point of view, I also still find the film very interesting, because again, I love watching alternate versions. I love like alternate realities and alternate edits, alternate cuts. We talked a little bit about that last week as well. So for me, the film as an alternative to the original, whichever one you prefer, is up to your own preference. But I like the idea of being able to kind of look at things from a different way, because then you get inspiration, or you get ideas, or you get some type of influence, or you get some type of effect from that experience. And it's like, oh, why did they do that? And it's like, well, why did they do that? And then you start thinking about it, or you see what somebody else did, and it's like, well, I wouldn't have done that. Well, what would you have done? Why don't you go do what you wanted to do? You know, like, who's stopping you? The hospital security?
Well, that's an interesting perspective, because while I've never seen the Mad Max movies, they're on my list of things I want to get to actually this year. Those movies are action movies, right? Those are like hardcore, gritty. And then so you bring in George Miller to do that, it's going to get a different vibe than, I mean, Richard Donner, one of my all-time favorite directors, directed the original episode with Shatner.
Yeah.
And it's, like you said, it's worlds apart. You know, so sometimes it's just those bits of decision that change the outcome dramatically. You know, it's not unlike the Psycho and the Psycho remake. I love Vince Vaughn, but that remake doesn't even hold a candle to the original film. And that's the exact same shooting script, shot for shot. So it's those intangibles sometimes, or just like that one decision can just change the entire project.
Yeah. Any final comments on Twilight Zone, the movie?
I think it won't be the last comment, because my wild card is Twilight Zone again. Because I tried to rent the Twilight Zone movie, and at the rental store, they gave me the wrong movie. They gave me one of 1994. And apparently it's two stories written by Rod Serling, but they were not used in the TV show. So they made like a movie of them. So the first one is called The Theater, with Gary Cole and Amy Irving. So it's really short, but I think it's typical of the kind of story you can have in the TV show.
What's the second one called?
The title is Where the Dead Are, and it's a story that takes place during the American Civil War. It's a very interesting story. It's for sure it's a real horror movie, this one. So I don't know if it's the kind of story you could have seen in the TV show.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned this, as these were kind of lost scripts and lost episodes. Maybe they were lost for a reason. Maybe they didn't fit the original tone. So yeah, I'd be curious to check them out. I'm sure Steve would be curious as well.
Yeah.
Just to see how the writing and the vibe comes across. Because again, Rod Serling, he wrote the scripts, but he didn't really direct a whole lot. He was primarily a writer, and a writer doesn't write the same thing all the time. I mean, sometimes they have a comfort zone where they really excel in a certain kind of story, whether it's mystery or drama or romance. But occasionally a writer does like to dabble in different areas simply as exercises, or to try or to see what they can accomplish in that realm. And these could have been episodes that he felt were not up to his standard at the time. But when people inherit properties, of course, they want to capitalize as much as possible. So yeah, I'd be really curious. So thank you for sharing that. That was your wild card for Monday?
For Monday, yeah.
And how did you like that compared to what you saw in the movie? Which one did you feel stronger about?
I prefer the 1983 because I don't know. You have I love short movies, and you have 5 stories in one. So I prefer the 1983 movie. But I think for people who know the TV show, maybe the one of 1994 is more appropriate.
Steve, what was your wild card this week?
My wild card this week was Maniac Cop.
Ooh.
I've never seen it before, but over the last few years, I've grown a deep love for Tom Atkins. I'm like, yeah, this guy is just the man.
He really is.
Yeah, and then and Bruce Campbell's in it. I'm like, all right, well, that's going on Monday's list. I'm throwing it on. I gotta say, it's definitely like a B movie, but there's some really good stuff in this movie, and it kept me entertained the entire time. Like 1 or 2 moments where like that's a little cheesy, but overall, that is a really good movie. I go back and watch that a few times. Some good scares in it. Surprisingly detailed story, which I really wasn't expecting. I figured just some maniac cop is going around killing people, right? I didn't expect a deeper, almost like a mystery inside this thing. So I was like, whoa, this is pretty cool. So yeah, I was pleasantly surprised with Maniac Cop. And then I looked it up. It got a pretty decent rating, but then the second one got an even higher rating. So now I'm super curious to go and watch the second one. So that might be my wild card for this week coming. But yeah, if you like Bruce Campbell, if you appreciate the legend Tom Atkins as I have come to appreciate him, I highly recommend that movie. I don't want to give anything away, but it's got good scares. It's got a nice little mystery wrapped in it. It's very effective in being creepy. Like I said, that old feel of cinematography, like I talked about in the 70s with The Sentinel. This has it. Even though this was filmed in the 80s, it still has that creepy, old school thriller horror vibe to it. And I got to say, I think they really utilized New York City really well in this film. And I think that New York City is almost a character in this movie.
Anne, have you seen Maniac Cop?
No, I haven't. But after what Steve just said, I want to see it.
Really? What exactly about what Steve said piqued your interest?
He seems so excited about it, so I want to see it. That's why.
Yeah, there's no substitute for enthusiasm.
He sold it well.
I've seen Maniac Cop a couple of times, and it is a lot of fun. Of course, like Steve said, Tom Atkins, Bruce Campbell, it's just a winning combination. You could go so far as to say, oh, well, yeah, it's a B movie, or, oh, it's like a junk food movie, but ain't nothing wrong with that.
No, there's nothing wrong with that. But also, I've seen it once, but it's almost becoming like a little personal favorite. I'd fight somebody in the streets over this movie, I think.
You had mentioned the writing, and it was written by Larry Cohen. He has a rap sheet a mile long. He's just a very, very phenomenal writer. He passed away a couple years ago, but if you go and look at his filmography, you'll see all over the map. And primarily in the low budget horror realm, It's Alive, Q, The Winged Serpent, The Stuff. He lived in that world, but he also sold some pretty big Hollywood scripts and properties. I'm pretty sure he wrote Phone Booth, which stars Colin Farrell and Kiefer Sutherland. He has a very, very interesting filmography, and he's just a very, very good writer. As far as low budget B films go, if you wanted good writing, you went to Larry Cohen. He was kind of the king in that realm. He elevated projects to a different level.
But I don't mean this in an insulting way, but that movie had no right to be that good. Like when I hit play on something called Maniac Cop, had no right to be that good.
And yet it was. Yeah, and it was directed by William Lustig, who directed the entire Maniac Cop series, 1, 2, and 3. Prior to that, he directed a movie simply called Maniac.
Yeah, I'm going to go back and watch the entire Maniac Cop series now. I think they've got a new fan.
Yeah, the first, I personally really enjoyed the first one. The second one is a lot of fun. I don't really remember the third one too much, but yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm glad you had a good pick. I was not so successful with my wild card this week. I chose a film called Trick or Treat from 2009. It's an anthology, another anthology film, sort of. It's an interwoven. There are 5 stories, but they're sort of interwoven and overlapping. Mm-hmm. It sounded intriguing. It sounded interesting. I liked a lot of the cast members, Dylan Baker, Brian Cox, Anna Paquin. But as I was going through it, it was just it was okay. I'm not going to say it was horrible, but for me, I don't care if I ever see it again. There were some fun ideas, but again, the overall presentation of it just didn't really do it for me. I think it would have been better as kind of a isolated installment presentation, in that here's one story, here's another story, here's another story. To interweave them the way that they did, it was interesting. But again, then I'm just very distracted by the community and the severe misfortune of the people in the community. And the other thing that was really weird for me while I was watching it was the vibe. It succeeded in presenting the Halloween vibe, and it's like Halloween on 11, because you just have people all over this community doing Halloween type things and other horrific associated things. But I didn't know if I was watching a horror movie or if I was watching an episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark? None of the kills happen on screen. So again, it's like I'm watching a horror movie with some horrific things, but then they're not showing me anything. And not that I need to see it, But if I'm watching a horror movie, I'm expecting to see horror. It just had a very kind of reeled in presentation that kind of threw me a little bit, in addition to the interwovenness of the stories. And there were some good ideas, there were some good performances, but overall, I don't think I'm going to be revisiting this one, and I don't care if I ever see the little Sam again.
There is a rabid fan base for this movie,
Yeah.
which I don't quite understand. Like, I mean,
No.
hey, if you like it, you like it. That's cool. But when I hear things like it's better than Creepshow, that's when the gloves come off. Because for my money, as far as anthology horror is concerned, Creepshow 1 is, as Pete would say, the high watermark. We don't get better than Creepshow 1. And for the people who say Creepshow 2 is better, I'll say it again. We don't get better than Creepshow 1. Maybe The Raft segment of Creepshow 2 could be on that level, but that's about it.
And have you seen Trick or Treat?
I never heard of it, so I don't know if it's something that came to Europe. I don't know. If you say that they have a strong fan base, maybe they translated it, but no, I never heard of it. And after what you said, Pete, I'm not sure I'm gonna watch it.
Well, that's fine too. And yeah, I'm certain that you could probably find the film in France. However, you yourself have told me that Halloween really isn't as big in Europe as it is in America. I mean, it's not an American holiday like Thanksgiving, but we celebrate it to an extreme that is not seen elsewhere around the globe. So it could also just be like the market isn't as strong.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's not celebrated in Europe. I would say it's not celebrated in many countries in Europe, because of course in the UK and in Ireland, which is Europe, they celebrate Halloween. I think it's really in English-speaking countries celebration, and maybe Spanish-speaking country celebration. I know in Spain they have something also, and I think it comes from Mexico. Yeah, it's a cultural thing that we don't have in France and Italy. Maybe in Germany, I don't know, but the east part of Europe, I'm not sure they celebrate Halloween, and for sure in France it's not so big. It's an occasion to eat some candies, but we don't wear costumes, or some people do, but it's not really something. Nobody's gonna knock on my door on Halloween's night, so yeah.
Well, speaking of eating, next we checked out The Menu. And I'm glad that everybody got to see this one. I had wanted to check it out. I saw, I guess, a TV spot for it. I don't really go and watch trailers because, again, I just feel like, well, what's the point? At this point in my life, like, I'm going to know whether I want to watch it either by the synopsis, by the title, or by the people involved, whether it's the actors or the cast and crew. The thing that intrigued me the most, of course, was the cast. And Ralph Fiennes, you really can't do much better than him. He just has such a filmography and such a charisma, such a delivery and presence that I'll watch him whether he's serving food or, attacking small children with a magic wand. It's one of his powers, he's very captivating. I was very excited to see The Menu because, again, it's a new movie. It's not something I had seen before, and it's something fresh that we could all partake in and discuss. There's no pre-history like with the Twilight Zone movie, where I've watched it for like 35 years and Steve was aware of it but avoiding it, and Anne had no idea about it. There's no, like, we're all going in at the same level on this film. So I was very excited to not only watch it, but to share it with my friends. I'll say that I enjoyed it, but when we got to the end, I was just kind of, instead of like, oh, wow, I was more like, huh. And that's the best way I can sum it up without giving it away.
I wrote the dessert is disappointing. So I didn't remember why I wrote that, but now I know it's true that the end is a bit disappointing. You expect something, because I thought that the film was pretty good, pretty awesome. I liked it actually. And I agree with you that at the end you expect something more than that. And you have some questions at the end about the female character. I mean, I had some question about the female character. But yeah, the main idea of the movie is really original. I thought it was really atypical to have this kind of story. And this kind of profession, I really know well, because as I told you, Pete, I was a wedding planner for 5 years. So during this time, I had the chance to go to fancy restaurants, and I met some chefs. And it's true that you have many people who can afford this kind of restaurants, but they don't enjoy it. It's just a service they like to buy to show to other people that they can buy it, you know? So I can understand the chef, the feeling he has about his customers. And we have someone famous in France, maybe you never heard of him. His name is Bernard Loiseau, and he committed suicide in 2003 because he was really under pressure. So he's a famous chef, he's a famous French chef, and he committed suicide because he was under pressure. He was overwhelmed about his profession, and he was very scared to lose a star at the Guide Michelin. It's a famous guide for very refined cuisine, you know. And yeah, he committed suicide 20 years ago, and that's crazy to think that he did that for nothing, because he had nothing to do. He didn't lose anything. He still has the 3 stars because his family took over the business. So the restaurant is still working well, but you know, you have so much pressure from the customers, from the critique, from everything in this profession, that sometimes you you become crazy, and that's what happens in that movie. He wants to do something artistical for the end, because for us in France, I don't know if it's the same for you, but for us, cuisine is like an art.
The thing that really spoke to me as I was watching it was the social commentary. That is really the heart of this film, and presenting it in such a fun way. I mean, it is a horror film, but it's a satire, and it plays with a lot of different themes and a lot of different ideas, and just the way that it's presented and the way it comes through when Ray finds his character, I think really, I mean, the dessert, it was beautiful, but I feel like the dessert was a little bit of a disappointment, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, well, fine. I mean, you can't go wrong with Fiennes. I mean, fantastic from top to bottom. I think he's what sold the entire movie for me. Halfway through, I said to myself, "Oh, I'm not sure if I'm going to like this." But then I was intrigued by it, and then the more it went on, the more I'm like, "Well, this is utterly ridiculous." But then, like you said, it's satire, and it's a little bit supposed to be a little bit ridiculous. And then at the end of it, it was like, I really like that movie, and I'm not even sure exactly why yet. I'm still drinking it in days later. But I really liked it. I mean, Anya Taylor-Joy I mean, everything I've seen her in so far, she's been great. I feel like Hannibal Lecter would eat at this place. It was shot beautifully. I thought the movie looked beautiful. I was getting the vibe also of kind of like Saw. Like, these people are in this room for a reason, and we got to figure out what the reason is. So I think if some of them it was very obvious, but I think if they would have delved a little bit further into some of those things and the significance. For me, if that was fleshed out just a little bit more, I think it would have been that much more impactful. But overall, top to bottom, I got to say it was pretty good, and I would probably revisit this one.
And
I don't know if you know who I'm talking about. You know, the guy who invited Margot with him, and is really like a fan of the chef. This character,
Nicholas Hoult.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that this character is a bit too enigmatic in the movie. You have many questions because he's having a bad end in the movie, and I felt like it was enigmatic that this guy who comes from nowhere. I mean, we understand that he had a relationship with the chef for a few months before coming, and he goes that far in the story. So I was. I don't know, something weird about this character. I felt that way watching it.
Well, I think, again, the character that Nicholas Hoult plays, he's part of that social commentary. He's like the prime example of a different breed of fanaticism that we've seen lately. Like, he's always taking pictures of his food and posting on Instagram. Like, that wasn't a thing 20 years ago, and yet it's what people do now.
You mean you weren't pulling out a Polaroid and taking a shot of your burger at the diner, Pete? That wasn't something you were partaking in?
No, and I wasn't taking a picture of myself in front of a marquee when I would go see a movie. Like, it was my life, and I was living it. I wasn't sharing it, and I wasn't trying to get attention by sharing it. he's doing it to such an extreme, and he's a young character, so like that's like his idea of the world is this is what you do. And then his extreme fanaticism with the chef and with the restaurant is just what he represents in the film. I think is a great criticism, and again, social commentary on people in our world. Not that they, should have to suffer his fate. Of course, that is an extreme fantasy invention of the film and the story, but I still feel that where Ray Fiennes' character is and is coming from, and where all of the people in the restaurant are and are coming from, are two completely different worlds, and one world is eating the other, and so that world has to fight back, and it's kill or be killed in Ray Fiennes' mind. Again, the nuances of Nicholas Hoult's character, I think through his experience, you don't need to know why everybody else is in that room. You kind of get that sense by taking the journey with him. I just wish that the ending was a little bit more savory.
I see what you did there.
So after the menu, we checked out House from 1985. I don't know, this is one, when I was a kid, I saw it a few times, but I primarily watched House 2, the second story. That was the big one when I was growing up. I have memories of this film, but they're not as strong as House 2. However, I did watch House 2 a few years ago, and that movie is just, it does not hold up as well as I remember it when I was a kid. So that's why I programmed House, because I wanted to kind of revisit this one. And it's okay. It's not a bad movie. And when you read the opening credits, you're like, oh, wow. I mean, it's basically the guys who made Friday the 13th. It's Sean S. Cunningham, who is Mr. Friday the 13th. And then it's Steve Miner, who directed Friday the 13th, part 2 and 3. So it's like, okay, well, yeah, like we're kind of in horror hands here. Let's see where this goes. And the film, it has a very Evil Dead 2 vibe, without being Evil Dead 2, and it precurses Evil Dead 2. Nevertheless, it does not deliver the way Evil Dead 2 does, in my opinion. The lead character is played by William Katt. I think his performance is good. He's a good actor. I just don't know that the material is all there, and I think a big part of it for this film, and for me, is the cinematography. It's very, very bright for a horror film. It almost looks like not quite a TV film, but I think it's just, it's overlit, and that deteriorates the mood, the atmosphere, and the effects. I feel like a lot of the effects would have been much more successful had they been lit in a better way. When it's too bright, you can see that it's a rubber puppet, and I'll just say that. The other thing that I always associate with this film is there's a, and this is way off topic now, but there's a band called Stormtroopers of Death, SOD, and they have a mascot named Sergeant D. And if you go look up SOD, Sergeant D, and you watch the movie House, you're going to basically wonder, how is this a coincidence? And yet it is, because they made the film and then the album came out like within weeks of each other. There is no overlap of influence. It's just mere coincidence. But yeah, whenever I watch this film or think of this film, I always think of that band. And it's kind of funny in that way.
I, like you, Pete, have not seen this movie in a very long time. And like you, I probably had seen the second story, House 2, more than I've seen House. But I've seen both of them. And yeah, as a kid, I remember these movies being scary and creepy and off-putting and whatever. And to go back and watch them now, it doesn't hold up. It's like, I agree with you, too bright. My big problem with the movie was, I get you want to do a little comedy. I'm okay with that. I get you want to do some horror. Cool. And then for me, the balance of these things was off. There's that one section in the middle where William Katt's character thinks he's done something horrific to someone he cares about without spoiling it. And that's probably the most cohesive section of the movie. Like, I get what's going on there. I get the motivations of all the characters involved. I get the paranoia. I get, is this real? Is this not real? Yeah, so he has all this stuff going on, and that's the strongest bit of the movie for me. And if we could have kept kind of that vibe through the whole movie and sprinkled in a couple jokes and a couple good scares, I feel like the whole blend, the whole recipe would have came out a lot smoother for me. Where some parts just felt extremely goofy, almost for no good reason, and then have like a really dramatic, almost halfway point. And then just the end is just, I don't know where they're trying to go.
I would say that it wasn't so bad. I mean, I understand what you said. For me, it's not a horror movie. It's more like, yeah, it was more funny than horrible. It made me thought of the movie Dead Alive that we watched for the first week of Shocktober. I don't know if you agree on that, but yeah, it's nice to watch once by curiosity. So I'm surprised that they made a second movie, but why not? Yeah, it's a funny one. If you want to watch something funny with a little bit of horror in it, you can watch it.
The villain at the end aesthetically looked badass. Awesome look. And I'm like, where are they hiding this guy the whole movie?
I mean, if they had introduced him earlier, then there would have been some direction for the series of events instead of a pointless filler babysitting sequence.
Oh, yeah.
They could have done more with it in connection with him and his missing son. Like, they could have tied it together and made it stronger.
Well, yeah, I mean, his kid gets lost in the pool, right?
Yeah.
And then he's giving this random kid he just met a bath. That's kind of creepy. And then, like, what if he would have saw his son in the bathwater? That would have been cool.
I also got a Dead Alive vibe while I was watching this, Anne, when, just the house and like the lone main character who's like experiencing all of this goofy, horrific stuff and trying to hide it from people. And then the comedy element, it was very Dead Alive as well. So I think, yeah, that's definitely a point worth exploring. Yeah, I don't really know that there's really too much more to say about this film either. I mean, again, William Katt, awesome. George Wendt, always a pleasure, but the story and the execution, Stephen Williams, again, popping up to save the day.
Guy's awesome.
Other than that, like the cast was good, the acting was good, but the story, it's, what was the movie last week that had the bad story and the great everything else? Oh, not last week, Barbarian.
Barbarian, 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, it's kind of like Barbarian, only not as acclaimed, but maybe in its day it was acclaimed. I think there's even a House 3, if I'm remembering correctly. No, I think there's 4. I think there are 4 House movies.
House 4, Foreclosure? That's what it should be called. Because I would definitely foreclose. No thanks.
Okay, so then moving on. Stephen.
Yes.
You're claustrophobic.
Oh boy, man. Yeah. Am I ever?
How is Buried for you?
This is my second time seeing it. I watched this years ago because I wanted to see from an actor's point of view. How do you keep an audience interested when it's just you for like an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes? Is it going to translate? Is it going to work? Man, it really worked. The fact that this guy is just buried alive and it's just him, a lighter and a cell phone and a pen for like an hour and 45 minutes. I thought that was great. The claustrophobia side of me, the first 5 minutes of rewatching this, I could feel like my chest tightening. Like, oh, Jesus, if this ever happened to me, I would go out of my mind. I'd probably have a heart attack and die inside the box before, I ever suffocated. You really get that claustrophobic feel. You get the feel of helplessness. You get your mind starts racing. Your pulse quickens. You get like a cold sweat, at least for me, being claustrophobic, thinking like all the things I would think in my mind. Even inside this one film, Ryan Reynolds really runs the gamut of a lot of different emotions, manages still to get a couple funny lines out, has some great dramatic moments. And it's just, I think as far for an actor put in that kind of a situation where the whole thing is on your back, I think he knocked it out of the park. So for me, Buried is always a win.
Yeah, I agree with what Steve said about Ryan Reynolds. I must say that he's really awesome in that movie because for me, yeah, where Ryan Reynolds, it's Deadpool, it's a guy in romance movies. So yeah, I didn't know much of him, of his filmography, but I must say that this one is a very good one, and I was surprised in a good way. So yeah, this movie is awesome. It's something that everybody should watch, really. And I think it's still relevant today. Unfortunately, that's something that could happen. And that's something you're going to think I'm crazy, but that's something I often dream of. I would like to experiment someday to be in a coffin. For real, a closed one, and to feel how to have the feeling of it. I know I'm crazy.
Oh boy.
It seems to be a cozy place, and I don't know. That's something I would like to try one day.
Cozy.
I'm a bit crazy.
Yeah. Okay, and
But
That's a
what
bucket list item, I guess.
I'm not claustrophobic, so.
For me, that's
Um,
a kick the bucket list.
but yeah, I agree with you, Steve, when you say that about the tension in the movie. After 20 minutes, I was like, okay, the film can go 90 minutes with such tension. It's going to be boring in a few minutes, but actually it's really not. Until the end, it's a gripping movie, and yeah, it was really surprising, especially the beginning. I expected something like an introduction of the character before it gets in the box, and no, it starts right in the box. So yeah, I was really wondering what's going to happen in 90 minutes, but actually they made it. So a very good movie.
If you're only going to watch one Ryan Reynolds film, I would say this is the one to watch because you really get to see everything he has to offer. He really just lays all of his cards on the table in this particular film. So his interactions, yeah, you wonder like, oh, well, how are they going to sustain this? And there are some surprises I will not spoil for anyone because I really think it's worth watching. However, unlike The Babadook, which I was very adamant required 2 viewings, I'm good with just one on this. I mean, it's very, very tough. It is a tough film. I remember the first time I saw it, I was like, wow, that's amazing. Everybody should see this movie. And then I didn't watch it again for like 10 or 12 years until the other night. And while I'm watching it, I was like, I don't think I ever want to watch this film ever again because of how it's making me feel and what it's making me think and what it's making me experience. It is probably one of the scariest movies ever made simply because it is realistic horror.
Yeah.
It is not some extravagant nightmare vision of some special effects guy. It is not a horrific fever dream exploration of terrifying images or elements or ghosts or goblins or anything like that. There is no supernatural element involved. It is legit horror that real people have actually experienced on this planet.
I like that this film doesn't feel American. Sometimes Americans in our cinema, things have to have like a hero or a shiny happy ending or whatever. And I think we get coddled by that. And sometimes in life, things are just blunt, straight to the point and in your face. And I think this movie is extremely in your face. And there doesn't have to be a monster lurking around the corner or something in the closet or something down the hall when the terror is, you're in it. It's just blunt, straightforward. This is your situation. It's amplified.
I like the interaction between the characters because, of course, you feel for the man in the box, but also how could you feel if someone calls you and tells you I'm in a coffin at the opposite side of the planet and I need help? What would you do? Especially at the beginning, he gets on voicemail, and I can't imagine his wife listening to the message, the feeling she could have. So yeah, I think this movie is interesting in so many ways, and it's quite smart to think about writing down the phone numbers and things like that. I'm not sure I would have this ability to do that when you panic, because we know that he's panicking. And yeah, it's really interesting. We see the administration. I was glad to see that your administration is as bad as mine. So, and the FBI is. It was interesting to see how it goes inside the FBI emergencies. But yeah, this movie is really something everybody should watch. And I agree with you, Pete, that when you watch it, you're like, oh, this movie is awesome. But you don't feel like watching it again. But you want to talk about it to your friends. You want to share it.
If you ask me, like, oh, what's your favorite horror movie? I'll rattle off a list of 10. But if you ask me, what's the best horror movie? This one is probably right up there just again because of its realistic sensibilities, setting, nature, execution, and tone. It's it's basically a one-man play when you think about it, and there's plenty of those floating around, but just the stakes are really, really high in this particular situation. And I don't know that this would even transfer all that well to a play because, again, it's the presentation, it's the environment, it's that sense of isolation. And in a play, you yourself as an audience are actually there, so the stakes are much lower. Here, it's just a character in a void, in a screen. So there's that distance and that separation. That's where like the medium is really utilized to maximum effect, where it's like, oh, I can see him, but I can't reach him. So
Right.
the danger becomes even stronger.
But it also feels like in a weird way that you're in the box with him at times.
Yeah.
Which is I guess that's the intrigue, and that's the magic, I think, of this film.
You said it's a horror movie. I'm not sure I would call that a horror movie. I don't know how I could call it, but maybe it's not an action movie because, of course, it's in a box, but it's kind of an action movie. You know, it's a drama, thriller movie. I would say more than a horror movie. Yeah, I felt more that way.
Well, for you, it seems like it's like a fantasy / wannabe documentary, according to your comments from before.
Yeah, but am I the only one to want to experiment that? I'm sure I'm not.
You know, as I was watching it, I was thinking, because I was trying to put myself into his character's position. It's like, well, what would I do? You know, like, what would I do in that situation? Would I survive? How would I survive? What would I be able to do? How clearly would I be able to think? How calm would I be able to remain? All these variables, and it's a nightmare situation. But at the same time, if you yourself voluntarily got in there, you wouldn't do so in a be-all, end-all kind of situation. It's like, okay, let me see if I can get out of the box. Like, throw 3 feet of dirt on top and let's see how well I can manage this. You know, like, is it going to be like Kill Bill where I just, 1-inch punch my way out? Is it going to be like Thriller where I'm crawling out of the grave? Like, I don't know, Anne. It's an interesting idea, not one that I think I would personally want to realistically explore. But, if there was like an amusement attraction where it's like, hey, see if you can survive in the coffin, how long can you last? Okay, maybe, Buried, I'm going to go ahead and say that's a unanimous vote for everyone. If you have not seen it, go check it out. It will not disappoint you. And try watching it completely in the dark as I did.
As did I.
Not me.
Friday, we had The Last Drive-In, which was a program that was on Shudder, hosted by Joe Bob Briggs, and nobody else really got to watch it. So I'll simply say that Joe Bob always puts on a good show. The films sometimes leave a little bit to be desired. And personally, this year we watched Demons 2, which is the sequel to Demons, and All Hallows Eve, which was another anthology film. And I'm going to just go ahead and say that it did disappoint. I did not care for All Hallows Eve for a number of reasons, but since Anne and Steve have not watched it, you can ask me and I'll fill you in person. Demons 2 wasn't bad. It was like nonstop action. So if you've seen the first one, and these are Italian productions by Dario Argento, he did not direct the films. He simply produced them and helped with the writing. Lamberto Bava, who is the son of legendary Italian filmmaker Mario Bava, he directed both this film and its precursor, the first one, and they are a lot of fun. They got a very strong 80s vibe to them. They do not disappoint in the horror or gore section. However, there are some opportunities with the storytelling and some of the effects. The makeup effects are fantastic. The creature effects are a little bit on the weak side. But overall, Demons 2 was pretty enjoyable, and All Hallows Eve, I'm not impressed, and I'm not very interested to check out the rest of the series. Art the Clown, Which brings us to the X-Files. We had another board game night over here at the old O'Brien residence. We broke out the X-Files board game by IDW Games, and this was the first time we've ever played it, so it was a bit of a learning curve. But while we were playing the game, we checked out the first film and the second film because it took us a long time to figure out how to play the game. In watching the films again, there's not much connection outside of the characters, and the series itself has such a disjointed history. I mean, it started in 1993, and it went for 9 seasons, and in the middle of that, there was the first film, and then after a hiatus, they brought out the second film, and then after another hiatus, they brought the series back for 2 seasons, so timeline-wise, it's very disjointed. However, the through lines of this series, the creator Chris Carter and the stars David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson, even Mitch Pileggi, they're always consistent. They're always solid. It's such a strong creative foundation for this series that you can jump in at any point and have fun.
Yeah, I watched both films, and to be honest, the last time I watched the show was I was 10 years old or something like that. So I remember, of course, the legendary duo, Mulder and Scully, but I didn't remember everything of it. So yeah, I was a bit nostalgic to rewatch something of X-Files, but I must say I agree with you that the first one is entitled "Fight the Future," and the second one is "I Want to Believe." And okay, "Fight the Future" for the first one, I don't really get why is "Fight the Future," but anyway. And "I Want to Believe," I was expecting something about UFOs. That's what you say, UFOs. You know. And it's not really about that. When you talk about X-Files, you expect something about UFOs. So I was a bit disappointed about the second one. And I didn't know about the relationship between Fox, Mulder, and Dana Scully. I didn't know that they had a child. So I was like, what? What is it?
Yeah, well, that comes about in the series. I mean, as far as these two films go, it is sort of in tune with the series. The series really follows two storylines. There's the storyline of conspiracy, cover-ups, and the syndicate, and the mythology of the X-Files, and then there's the Monster of the Week element, where there's a standalone episode that involves these characters and the unexplained phenomenon. So the first film really falls into that mythology tract where they're dealing with the black oil and the syndicate and all the stuff that you get from the show. So if you have not watched the show, the first film it will entertain you and it won't leave you behind, but you won't really be up to par with what's going on. The second film, I think they tried to do the Monster of the Week thing and the isolated story so that people who had not watched the series could just jump right in and have an adventure with these characters. Was it the best idea? I'm not sure, because at that point, you're relying heavily on your fan base for the success of the film, and those are the people you're making the film for. So if you disappoint them, then they're not going to be happy. And I think that's what happened with the second film. Personally, I enjoy both films to varying degrees, mostly because I love the characters and I love the background of the show. But I could definitely see how people would be disappointed, especially by the second film. And as you said, the title, "I Want to Believe," that phrase has such a strong significance throughout the series. So when you get to a film that doesn't tie into that, it makes people go, huh? What?
I started watching this show years ago. I started watching it again last year, but then I got caught up with a bunch of other, things to watch. I remember enjoying the film when I saw it in the theater. I always enjoyed watching the series. I was enjoying the rewatch that I was doing currently. One of the things that always popped out the most for me were sometimes cameos by famous actors at the time, and then looking back, people who became famous that might not have been famous at that moment. So it's always cool on a show like that to see who can pop up in any given episode. One of my favorites is Beyond the Sea from the first season. Brad Dourif, who's known as Chucky and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, he plays Billy. But such a creepy episode, and he's always effective as being creepy. But this show, I think, has a little bit of an influence from the Twilight Zone. It has that what's going to happen. There's a mystique around things. That. Only difference is this ties together mostly in an overall, arcing story. But I think it borrows a little bit from the Twilight Zone to kind of bring it full circle here. But I've always enjoyed it, and I will continue to go back and complete this rewatch.
Yeah, and honestly, the show you had mentioned Twilight Zone influence. There's another show from the 1970s called Kolchak the Night Stalker, which stars Darren McGavin, which most people know him as the old man from A Christmas Story. He plays Kolchak, and he's an investigative reporter. And that is really, if you watch that show, that is the genesis for the X-Files. So if you can track down Kolchak the Night Stalker and you're a fan of the X-Files, you'll certainly see the influence.
I was happy to see Martin Landau in the first movie because I love this actor. He's really famous in France. I guess he's really famous in America, but in France he's really famous for his vampire role. I think it was Dracula, no? He played Dracula. Anyway, for us is very famous for being a vampire. And I noted that the second movie was written and directed by Chris Carter. I think he's the creator of X-Files. That's why I was so surprised about the relationship between Mulder and Scully in it, because for me, the aim of the duo is to watch, to see that a man and a woman can work together, can be friends together without having sex involved, but apparently at the end of the story they are together. So yeah, I was a bit disappointed about that, but that's all. Those two movies were not bad. I'm not saying that they were bad, but when you watch the beginning of the TV show, you don't expect that for a movie of X-Files. That's my opinion.
Well, in the second half of the television series, they do develop a romantic relationship and they do conceive a child. So, and that's a big part of the revival series as well, is their relationship and then their son.
And our friend Stephen Williams appears in the X-Files.
He's everywhere. We should just have him as like the fourth voice on this podcast, really.
Bring him in. Why not? Mr. X.
Yeah, Mr. X. He's fantastic. That's it for this week. I mean, I would say Twilight Zone the movie, interesting start, wild card, whatever. Menu was a lot of fun. Weird aftertaste. House, whatever. Buried is definitely, funny enough, the high mark for the week. And then, the X-Files, you can't necessarily go wrong with the X-Files. It's always fun, but there's a lot there. So it's best to just start at the beginning.
I'm looking forward to the movies this week coming up.
So coming up this week we'll be watching Misery, The Woman, which came as a recommendation to me earlier this year, Burke and Hare, which revisits our friend John Landis, as well as Simon Pegg and Andy Serkis, The Ruins, Event Horizon, our third and final wild card, followed by another board game night with the Ghostbusters. So yeah, this week, I've seen about half of these films, but of course, I'm always looking forward to a wild card because I like to explore. I think I have a good one in mind for this Friday, if I can remember it, when Friday rolls around. But I'm excited to revisit Misery, and I've never seen The Woman. I'm not holding my breath, but we'll see what happens. But I am excited to check out Burke and Hare because I like the people involved, so we'll see what comes of it. Anne, what are you looking forward to this week?
Yeah, I'm looking for Misery too, and Ghostbusters, because I watched that when I was a kid, but I watched the cartoon. I don't know if you have it I guess it's an American thing, but we have a cartoon, Ghostbusters.
Of course, we have the real Ghostbusters cartoon. That was our bread and butter.
That's a staple.
So are you going to be watching the entire Ghostbuster franchise or just the first film, Anne?
Probably the first film. We'll see, but...
Okay, well, have fun with that. And Steve, what are you looking forward to?
I never need an excuse to watch Misery, but I've seen it probably 50 times in my life. Love that movie. A couple of these titles I haven't heard of, so curious to see what that brings, because we've had some good surprises. Ninth Configuration for me was a good surprise. I'd heard of it but never saw it, so who knows? Maybe we'll have another surprise gem in our hands.
That about does it here for us this week at the Visually Hidden Podcast. My name's Peter O'Brien, and you can catch Steve on Steve's Pop Culture Corner over there on Instagram. He's always posting cool and exciting things, and he always has some fun Halloween posts as well, so look forward to those. Anne and I are, of course, on a Letterboxd, and you can check out what we've been watching and what we think over there. So until next time, this is Peter O'Brien signing off.